Welcome to State of Play. I'm Will Todman, Chief of Staff of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this podcast, we bring together our leading experts to unpack the latest geopolitical developments from around the world and what it all means. 2025 has been a transformative year for geopolitics. Conflict spread across the Middle East, hitting Iran and Qatar directly. The Ukraine war continues despite renewed diplomacy, and it's also contributing to growing alignment between US adversaries. And now the threat of war in Venezuela looms. Trade policy turned into open economic warfare, with tariffs and export controls becoming one of the Trump administration's preferred tools. Technology is now decisively at the center of geopolitics, with AI chips, cloud infrastructure, undersea cables, increasingly serving as strategic assets. And then in response, middle powers from the Gulf to Southeast Asia are beginning to learn how to play their larger rivals off against each other and are getting more confident in that. At the same time, diplomatic red lines are blurred, humanitarian norms are weakened. Lots of governments no longer consider today's instability to be a passing phase, but the new normal. And then came the Trump administration's national security strategy. This has accelerated the rift in transatlantic ties, as we discussed last week. It has reimagined global US priorities, and it seems to signal a decisive shift away from strategic competition with great power rivals. So, on today's episode, we are asking, what's most important about what has changed in 2025? And what does it mean for what comes next? We will explore the most important developments, the assumptions that have collapsed, and why understanding this year is essential to making sense of what lies ahead. We still have 3 more years of the Trump administration, after all. And so for this big picture assessment, I'm joined by my colleague Victor Cha, President of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department, and also our first ever external guest, Dr. Thomas Wright from our neighbors up Massachusetts Avenue at the Brookings Institution. Tom is a senior fellow with the Strobe Talbot Center for Security, Strategy and Technology. And Tom, you most recently served as special assistant to the president and senior director for strategic planning at the National Security Council in the Biden administration. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So great to have Tom on.
It is. It is indeed. There is no one better to cover all of this in half an hour, which is what I will now try to make you do. And it's hard to know where to begin. But I think probably my first question is, what are the most important ways that you think US foreign policy has transformed in the last year? I mean, there's a lot of noise, but are there certain things that you're really focusing on that you think helps us understand how it's shifting?
And thank you for having me. I didn't realize I was the first ever external guest, so that's quite an honor. I think, obviously a lot has happened and there's lots to talk about, but I think to me, the two obvious things that I think are pretty fundamental, have been the administration's shift on international trade, where I think on January 20th, the US tariff rate globally was an average of 2.3%. And as of, I think, about 4 weeks ago, it was 17.9%. And, they did that, I think, without significant retaliation from other countries. I think there will be a long-term cost to that. So we'll see that over time. But that does feel like the end of a moment where we did have, if not perfectly free trade, at least sort of an open global economy. And I think we are seeing other forms of deglobalization, at the same time. And then the other bit, is I think the shift away from strategic competition. I think at the end of the Biden administration, we were very, fixated by this idea of adversarial alignment between America's adversaries and competitors. We had, I think, prioritized strategic competition, albeit in an interdependent world for 4 years. The first Trump administration, I think, actually also pursued, what they call great power competition. There's a broad bipartisan consensus that that's an incredibly important element, maybe the organizing principle of U.S. foreign policy. And I think we've seen this year that the president, at least, and many of his key officials, if not all of them, there are some exceptions, have pulled back from that. So I think those are the two most consequential from my point of view.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. I would add to that by saying I think that there has been a change in the U.S. in terms of thinking about not about friends and allies, but thinking about, to be crude, making money. Mm-hmm. That so much of our diplomacy, what we think is important, is now determined commercially. I was at a dinner the other night where somebody said that the reason the United States should support Taiwan is not because it's a democracy, but because it's important in terms of semiconductor chips. And that very language was replicated, well, more or less replicated in the national security strategy when they talked about Taiwan and the first island chain being important in terms of chips and in terms of commercial shipping lanes. But that commerce, that was about it. And then the other is the sort of metric for how the United States deals with any new issue that arises, or any new potential partner or new potential adversary, is determined largely by a transaction, a profit maximization transaction, as opposed to a value, a common value, or a principle, or anything along those lines. Those are pretty big changes in terms of the way, if you had to sort of predict how the United States would respond to a particular issue, you would use these two compasses, if you will, rather than thinking about, well, is that somebody that's threatening an ally? Is that somebody that's threatening the open liberal trading order? Is that somebody who's threatening democracy? Like, these things are not questions that are asked now. It's transactions and it's commercial opportunity.
So those shifts are huge for US allies to comprehend and to adjust to, I think. Have there been any ways in which US allies have responded to these shifts in ways that have surprised you? Tom, you just alluded to the fact that in the short term with tariffs, there hasn't been as big, a pushback, but there could be long-term costs. How do you see, allies shifting in the short to the longer term?
Yeah, I guess I've been a little bit surprised by the degree of accommodation. And I think that's in part because most US allies, if not all of them, don't really have a plan B. I think they really do need to partner with the United States. They would like to develop more capabilities and autonomy, obviously. But that's really hard, and it's hard for many reasons, not the least of which is that the United States for decades has basically, partly said spend more, but also said don't spend it on things that are duplicative. Please, remain dependent on us for, naval assets and long range strike or, ISR. And so the US has really pushed the idea of, a core US commitment, and others should be more capable within that structure, right? So they don't really have sort of an alternative, certainly not one that can be easily built inside a year or two. And so one of the things that struck me this year was basically, under pretty coercive circumstances, especially on the economic side, but also on the security side, they really, bent over backwards to try to give the Trump administration what it wanted. And also, symbolically and just personally to sort of play into, what he was doing. And I think for Europe, the shock in part with the national security strategy was, despite doing all of that, despite being as basically as good an ally as President Trump could sort of wish for, they still were sort of hit with this at the end, which was, I think, a fairly sort of callous sort of approach toward them, and then wanting to foment sort of political disruption inside their societies.
Can I ask what you mean by the symbolic piece there, where you said about sort of bending over backwards, even symbolically? Are you talking about the NATO commitments to spend more on?
No, I mean like the UK offering a second state visit. European leaders coming over and saying lots of very, very positive things, and them trying to find every which way to say that they appreciate him and the role he's
Daddy
playing.
Or something like that. Wasn't that part of it?
So I have I wouldn't call it a theory, but I have an idea about why allies and partners in Europe and Asia over the past year really have sort of bent over backwards, as Tom said. And I think in part, they were all operating against their most basic policy instincts when they do this, right? But the reason for this, I think, is not because, they want to get on Trump's good side, although that has something to do with it. But I think they basically see sort of this America First policy as essentially signaling to allies and partners that they must bear the long-term custodial burden of the alliance. Like, they must make sure that the alliance doesn't crack, doesn't fracture, doesn't fall apart, doesn't suffer irreparable damage, so that 3, 4, 5 years from now, there's still an alliance that they can work with. So I think many of them, certainly in the first year, were shocked by what the United States was doing. And many of them, their initial reaction was to resist. I mean, some countries, at least rhetorically, were willing to resist, but they all in the end gave in because in the long term, they value the relationship with the United States and they wanted to remain there 3, 4 years from now. Having said that, I think many of them also, in doing these things like offering a second state visit or giving the president lots of different ornamental gold things, also are looking for opportunity, right? They're trying to take advantage of the fact that this particular president is very unconventional, and many of things that they might have wanted in the alliance relationship that they could not get in the past. They see this as an opportunity to try to get those things.
What kind of things do you mean? So,
like one very clear example, like in the areas that I work on, is South Korea committed $350 billion of investment to the United States. That's a huge number. That's almost half of their foreign exchange reserves. It's just an absolutely. You remember the first Trump term, they were haggling over whether South Korea should pay $1 billion or $5 billion for host nation support. We're talking about $350 billion now. But at the same time, I think that the Koreans saw an opportunity to try to push for things, given the amount of stuff they were giving to the United States, to push for things that they could never get before. So this includes potential changes in U.S. legislation that will allow for the building of U.S. ships outside the United States, the potential for a renegotiation of the nuclear energy agreement between the United States and South Korea that potentially might allow for enrichment and reprocessing of fuel, and then of course the possibility of South Korea acquiring or even building a nuclear submarine. So that's just one example, but I think many countries, as they are, seeking to preserve the long-term equities in the alliance, willing to sort of bend the knee to Trump, providing, made-for-TV summit deliverables, are also looking for opportunities. But I agree with Tom. Like, this is what happened in the first year, but I'm not sure it's going to happen in year 2, 3, or 4 if the United States keeps pushing in this way. If they keep pushing in this way. Some actors, whether European or Asian, might start thinking about Plan Bs.
And we haven't really seen much of that yet. One of the things that has sort of surprised me a bit is we don't see a huge amount of coordination between, Western allies and allies in East Asia, or at least maybe that's just not come to the surface yet. But what kinds of things would you be looking out for if we would start seeing the development of a Plan B that looks like not simply bending the knee to the US, but starting to push back through collective, some kind of new collective action?
Well, I mean, I think there's one other sort of important contextual point just to understand the answer to that, which is that, all the allies and partners are facing this challenge from the US in a very hostile world, right? So they face real threats from Russia or from China or from North Korea. And those aren't going away, and those haven't fundamentally changed. So this Trump administration comes in a in a hyper competitive world that in many ways bears the characteristics of a pre-war world, which is not to say that war will occur. It's just what you would see in a pre-war era. A lot of that is borne out by what you see today. And so, I think if this were to happen in, the 1990s or in maybe the, first Obama term, period, you might see more pushback because they would feel like they had more, they had more margin for error. Whereas right now, I think they feel they don't have that. I think there is a lot of discussion between U.S. allies and partners, probably pretty quietly. I think they are swapping notes and trying to work more closely with each other. But again, they don't really have. They're trying to buy time, manage the problems, and basically get as much of a U.S. commitment as they can. And I think for the most part, they will feel like they've done a reasonable job of that. I think the Europeans would feel like they've, until a few weeks ago, gotten Trump into a much better place in Ukraine, like selling weapons, continuing the intel support, mending relations with Zelensky a little bit. I would defer to Victor in the Indo-Pacific, but I think there, Australia certainly feels reasonably good about the visit that Albanese had. I think South Korea feels reasonably good. Japan, I think, might be a little more complicated, but for the most part, I think from a pure national interest point of view, I think they would feel like that this was the best course of action and that they could point to some tangible things. But obviously in the medium to long term, there's lots of problems there too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that in terms of Plan Bs, as Tom said, on the security side, it's a bit harder, right, to think about Plan Bs because it's an unprecedentedly unpredictable environment. Like hedging with Russia or with China is not that comforting, I think. But certainly on the trade side, I think there's a lot of Plan B thinking and talking that's going on now. I mean, just anecdotally, I was at a conference in Ottawa where a track 1.5 in Ottawa where, members of the Carney government were talking not about the United States and reciprocal trade tariffs. They were talking about their new free trade agreement with Indonesia. And then when I talked to like scholars in Europe and I asked them like, what are you thinking about Plan Bs? ASEAN often comes up, Southeast Asia, particularly in terms of trade, trade and investment. So I think clearly countries are thinking about this. I do think that they are talking to each other quietly. I think everybody was just shocked by this reciprocal tariffs, and the EU is one thing, but countries in Asia, they all sort of bilaterally sought to cut their own deals. Like Japan and Korea, didn't talk to each other. They each sought to cut their own deals. But I think the longer this goes on as we go into year 2, 3, and 4, I expect that we'll see more of that, particularly, again, if the United States, I don't think Trump will declare a second Liberation Day, but he might like press tariffs in certain sectors. And that could be the thing that pushes some of the allies and partners to not just think about Plan Bs, but actually start trying to execute on some of them.
So I don't want this to all be about the US, but I do want to ask a bit more about what is emerging that might define a Trump doctrine. Is it too soon to say what that looks like now? I mean, earlier, Victor, you said it's really the commercial focus. It's about making money. But this national security strategy, it looks really different. There's pieces about kind of dominating the Western Hemisphere, really not talking about China and Russia in nearly the same extent. How would you define the contours of the Trump administration's foreign policy and what looks like a doctrine?
So I'll go first. I take my cue from the NSS, right?
Yeah.
Which is, that is supposed to be the document, right, in every administration that sort of tells us what the priorities are. And, very clearly for Trump, it's, number one is Western Hemisphere, right? Number two is China, but it's largely economic competition, right? This is the article that Tom has written about how Trump is definitely an economics hawk, and trade hawk, but we don't know if he's actually a security hawk on China. And for allies and partners in Europe and Asia, it's about spending more on defense and investing more in the United States. And then the fourth thing is economic security, defense industrial base and economic security. So, in the NSS, I noticed that the word military deterrence does not come up until page 13 in the document. Of what, a 20-page document, 19-page document. So that tells you something about now every president is allowed, of course, to have their priorities, and these just happen to be the priorities of this particular president, but they are very different from what we are used to seeing from the United States.
Yeah, I would just add, I totally agree with Victor. I would just add that I think for Trump himself, his worldview has been very clear for well over 10 years. And or maybe for about 10 years. And that's, he cares about three things. He has always been more bothered by America's allies than by his adversaries, because he's worried about, trade and security commitments. And so that's sort of one thing. And he's complained about allies going back to the mid-'80s. Second thing is he's always been a mercantilist and a protectionist and liked tariffs and felt like they were underused and opposed free trade, which he always thought was unfair to the US in some way. And the third thing is he's always had an admiration for strong men and believed that he can sort of cut deals, with them, and has admired them more than sort of democratic leaders. And I think if you knew nothing except those three things, right, I think that will get you pretty far. I think they have to find the policy in exactly the way Victor said in the NSS. I think some of that is a system around him. I don't know how much he personally, cares about, the everything in the Western Hem. I mean, obviously he does to some degree, but I think there's also some officials pushing that, maybe other elements as well. But I think it's actually fairly clear. It may not be a doctrine in a sense that it's a really sophisticated, coherent plan, but I'm not sure that matters all that much, because I think it is pretty clear and it's pretty consequential.
On the Western Hemisphere, I mean, to me, Trump really thinks about the competition with China largely in mercantilist terms and also in terms of rebalancing trade. Like the one thing he cares the most about is this huge trade deficit, merchandise trade deficit we have with China. But this focus on and I agree with what Tom has written about, I do think Trump is much more of an economics hawk than he is a security hawk. And so for allies and partners in Asia, the first quarter of 2026, even though they may be feeling good now because they got through 2025, they got summits and good agreements with Trump, the first quarter of 2026 will be very important, because that's when Trump is going to go to China and meet with Xi Jinping. And they got sort of a placeholder agreement in their last meeting on the sidelines of APEC. But, everybody's at least building up for this meeting in the spring to be sort of the big trade deal between the United States and China. And so we'll see what that means, what China will ask for on the security side, on the economic side, but also on the security side, how this might cut into alliance equities. But the other thing is the Western Hemisphere focus, the Trump corollary. It could end up causing China to back into security competition. It could get Trump to end up backing into security competition with China, in the sense that if the Western Hemisphere is that important as a part of this new doctrine, there's a lot that China is doing in the Western Hemisphere. And there's a lot, whether we're talking about ground satellite stations or the Panama Canal, things of this nature. And we don't have established patterns of interaction between the United States and China in the Western Hemisphere. We have clear patterns of interaction, military contingency plans, very clear language that we use between the United States and China over Taiwan, right? And anytime anybody veers off that language, all these alarm bells go off. I remember when the president I worked for, President George W. Bush, after the EC 121 incident, referred on television to China to Taiwan as an ally, and then everybody went crazy. Like alarm bells went off in Washington and Beijing. Like that's a change in like we don't have, and everybody then tried to hammer it back into place. We don't have that kind of interaction, established pattern of interaction with China, in Latin America, in Central America, and yet China is doing a lot there. And so, in a sense, this focus on the Western Hemisphere and the de-emphasizing of security competition with China overall could end up backing the United States into security competition with China in this part of the world.
Mm-hmm. And presumably, China is not necessarily okay with ceding the Western Hemisphere to the US in the way that the national security strategy kind of asks for. So there could be real friction there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the case, but I also think they're probing and pushing as much as they can. It's sort of like they did in the South China Sea. They just keep probing and pushing to see, sort of classic gray zone activities to see how far they can go without eliciting a U.S. response. And so my main point there is that the two sides aren't well prepared for like meeting head to head in this part of the world, whether it's gray zone or otherwise. And so it's just something to watch out for.
We've spent a lot of time talking about the US, but what other shifts in the international system, new relationships, new sources of friction are things that you think we should be focusing on and paying attention to that might not involve the US as directly and might not be because of Trump and what he's changing?
Yeah, I mean, two answers to that. I think this is not a dodge on your question, but it's a little bit about the US. But I think there's a whole host of things that this administration is not talking about that are incredibly important. And under a different administration, I think in a bipartisan way, there will be a lot of obsession about. I think one are the sort of Chinese threats, the PRC's threats to critical infrastructure in the US, telecommunications, water supply, electricity plants, and the like, where we saw with the Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon operations, real vulnerabilities that I don't think have been fully addressed. And I think Congress is aware and working on that. That wasn't mentioned in the national security strategy, but I think, that is one. I think there are others mainly related to strategic competition, including the continuing alignment, I think, between U.S. adversaries and competitors. So I worry a bit about, just we're talking a lot about Venezuela, or we're talking a lot about tariffs, or we're talking a lot about, culture war issues in Europe. I mean, a lot of those seem, far less significant in some cases, completely manufactured compared to the things that are not actually, being addressed. And I worry that we won't necessarily hear updates either, from the administration, based on the intelligence and information that they're gathering. More broadly, I think the one I would mention is, I think, China-Europe is interesting, because in many ways, China's relationship with Europe this year has gotten worse, not better. I think part of that is economic, is just the continuing massive overcapacity question and the trade question. And so even though you see this friction, between the United States and Europe, you don't see sort of a rapprochement, I think, between Europe and Beijing, in part because what China is doing in a way that negatively impacts Europe is entirely independent of the US, right? And so I think there are interesting geopolitical fractures out there. And then I think, I think the role of the Gulf on technology, on AI chips, I think that's partly to do with US policy. I think it's been a big development this year as well.
Yep. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I'll just focus on two. One of them, Tom already mentioned, which is this growing cohesion among the adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, what we at CSIS call the CRINCs. This is, again, it's not a quad per se, but there's a lot of activity. We tried to measure it in some of our studies, political, economic, and security, military activity among the countries. That maybe as a group, they're not that willing to operate together. There's also a lot of distrust in that group. But even these bilateral legs can cause a great deal of problems for the United States and allies and partners. And then the other is something that we saw a bit of during the Biden administration, which was the growing interaction between Asia and Europe.
Mm-hmm.
The two theaters sort of coming together. The Ukraine war did a lot to bring these two theaters together. But the United States is not as enthusiastic about that currently as it was in the previous administration. And yet there is so much potential there, whether we're talking about the so-called Indo-Pacific Four and NATO, or maritime cooperation, economic security cooperation, critical minerals. I think there's lots of opportunity there. I mean, I give the administration credit for creating this new tax silica arrangement among countries with regard to certain critical minerals. I mean, I think this is a very good thing. So that's another area where I think there has been a lot of work by the administration, both the Biden administration, Trump 1, then the Biden administration, Trump 2, has been on trying to organize allies and partners in Europe and Asia and Southeast Asia on securing supply chains and critical minerals.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I could talk all day, but we should probably start to close this. So I have my 3 questions that I always ask towards the end. And this is probably the hardest because I'm going to make you sum up a whole year in one word. Can you sum up geopolitics in 2025 in one word, or I will allow you one phrase since this is quite so broad?
Okay, I'll go first. So the one phrase I would use is strategically predictable, but tactically unpredictable.
Okay.
And that largely refers to the United States.
Okay.
Because, the United States still drives geopolitics. And so I think in many ways, and again, like Tom said, Trump's views on things are very clear, and they were clear long before he became president. Long before he became president, when he was a businessman in New York City in the 1980s and 1990s, he's been saying this sort of stuff for a long time. So strategically quite transparent, but tactically how the United States acts on these strategic beliefs is very unpredictable.
I would say a fracturing of the West, going to our conversation just now. But, I think to me, the big story is that you had this alliance sort of system that was remarkably sort of stable and deeply integrated with lots of issues over time. But at its core, there was a certain degree of mutual understanding on the rules and, especially economically, but also in the security realm. And those, I think, have come apart. And as we discussed, countries are trying to piece it back together or buy time. But I think that is the big story, which I think is sort of an American story about Trump and America first, sort of choosing to fracture that block.
And is it a divorce? Is it a separation? Is it problems to be worked through? We'll see. Okay, so another really unfair question. This is hardly a quick fire round at this stage, but of the US, China, and Russia, who has had the best year and who's had the worst year? And you can define that however you want, because that's a ludicrously broad question.
So of the 3, I would say the U.S. has had the best year. It's been different, certainly a different period of time for many allies and partners. But, the United States, the Trump administration has been successful at getting allies and partners in Europe and Asia to increase defense spending. He has, Trump has always believed, rightly or wrongly, that the United States has an average lower tariff rate than the rest of the world. Apparently, in the first term, he used to go around and quiz staffers about do you know what the average tariff rate in India is? Do you know what it is in the EU? Do you know what it is in the United States? And so it's interesting to me that Tom cited the numbers like 2 to 3% for the United States. and like 17 or 18%, like that's the 15% tariff right there.
Yeah.
So in a sense, I think, and the way the United States done it has certainly been shocking and disconcerting to many who are used to a particular order that was created over the past 70 years. But if you just look at it in terms of the numbers among the three, the United States, I think, has had the best year.
Yeah, I would say China, because I think China became Rush Doshi at CFR, I think, has wrote a piece, which I agree with, that this is the year that they became a real peer of the United States. I think in part because Trump fired everything he had at China initially economically. The response from Beijing sort of shocked him, both indirectly in terms of how dependent the US was just on goods coming from China and products coming from China, but then also directly in terms of critical minerals and other elements that Beijing could turn on and off. They, I think, then backed away from their coercive attempts and went into sort of deal-making mode. And they also backed away significantly from the technological export controls.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was a huge win for China, because that, I think, is the part of our policy that they dislike the most, right? Which I think is incredibly important for technological competition. So I think they won on those. And then more broadly, I think they have this weakening of the alliance system, which I think if there was one core US advantage that drove them crazy, it was sort of the US alliance system, because the more aggressive and assertive they were, the stronger that became, right?
Yeah.
So it was like this paradox for them. And that looks like there's a glimmer of hope for Beijing that might be coming apart. So I think that I think they will finish this year. They were very nervous after the election, I think, in terms of the unpredictability of Trump and what it would mean. I think now they feel like they have his number and that they, are on track for this April meeting with very little prospect of sort of, the US engaging in competitive actions that will put them on the back foot.
Okay, so finally then, is there one word or phrase that you wish you could ban pundits from using when talking about geopolitics, foreign policy, or just more broadly?
Well, I don't know if it's pundits, but it's this idea of like, let's look at everything in 2 weeks. Just focus on like 2 weeks. Oh, well, let's look at it in 2 weeks. Let's see how it looks in 2 weeks. Or, we seem to hear that a lot over the past year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a really tough one. I struggle with this, but I think the one that sort of frustrates me the most is like the addiction thesis, in artificial intelligence, which Jensen Huang and David Sachs talk about, which is, if we just sell everything to China, then they will become addicted to our AI stack and they won't build an indigenous, capability. Yep. And it just seems, this completely ahistorical, like that's never worked in any other issue with China, with this China. Yep. They've had a very clear approach on all other types of manufacturing. And then it's clearly, going to be incredibly counterproductive, but it continues to be out there as this sort of theory of the case, I think, that's justifying the easing of export controls.
Okay, absolutely. Okay, so as a holiday episode, this was a little heavy, maybe, but you covered an enormous amount of ground. So we've talked about tariffs being one of the most fundamental changes, the shift away from geostrategic competition with China and Russia. And then Victor, the commercial focus, how so much of this seems to be about making money and transactional. Then when talking about allies, of course, there's the shock from the allies, the bending the knee, but then some of them exploring some of these new opportunities. But Tom, I think you pointed out, one of the reasons why they haven't begun to band together so much is because ultimately they're facing a really hostile context and it's difficult for them. This has not changed the challenge of China, of Russia. Maybe there are some quiet conversations about how to coordinate, but that's likely more on trade than on security. So when we're looking forward to 2026, Victor, you said in Q1, I think that's the April visit, that when President Trump will visit Xi in China, we'll be looking at, is there a big trade deal there? And But some of these other big things to watch out for: the Chinese threats to critical infrastructure that are real vulnerabilities in the US system that don't seem to be getting as much airtime as they should. This growing alignment between US adversaries. It's been de-emphasized, but even the bilateral ties that are growing between them are really important. China and Europe. No big rapprochement there yet. So that's something to watch how that shakes out. And then also the Gulf investment in AI and how AI is transforming, I think, the Middle East in some interesting but probably not fully explored ways. So then you've talked about the fracturing of the West being a big theme of the year, the strategic predictability versus tactical unpredictability of this Trump administration. And then I think you slightly disagreed on who had the better year, the US or is it China? And then one of the other things to look forward to is, China feels like it has withstood Trump's pressure, fired back, the weakening of the US alliance system. But maybe we should be looking at the Western Hemisphere, where there really aren't the same kind of rules of the game there. So much to think about. Maybe we'll have to make this an annual thing. And if you're willing, come back in 2026. And who knows what will have changed by then. But you have at least provided a lot of things for us to look out for going forward. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Tom, for coming down. Thank you, Victor.
Of course.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Happy holidays. Yes, happy holidays.
Thanks for listening to State of Play. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to it wherever you heard it. And you can find more analysis at www.csis.org/geopolitics. Until next time.